email there. All right, without further ado, let's get moving. Yeah, that's what's going to happen. Of course. There we go. All right, just a couple of glitches because this is the first time we've done a webinar, so it has to make me look like I don't know what I'm doing because I don't. All right, but something I do know about is wildlife, and specifically pollinators and native plants. So, Amy, can we see the screen okay? Okay, just wanted to double check I wasn't talking and no one could see what was happening. So going back to 5th grade, quickly, every wildlife, whether you be a human, animal, plant, we all need the same things. We need water, shelter, food, air, and space. So obviously we need water to drink, air to breathe, space to move around in, especially traveling from place to place. We need space, and we need food and shelter. And the things that we can do best in our backyard for our wildlife is the food and shelter. So let's talk about that. Okay, now I didn't want to have a ton of text on my in my presentation, but there is going to be a little bit, so just read it because it's the good stuff. So I'll just read it for you to make it a little bit more dramatic. Backyard by backyard, your backyard, neighborhood by neighborhood, all of our neighborhoods. When we're adding native plants to our yards, we create stepping stones. These are our wildlife corridors that help to connect our formerly isolated habitat islands. So think about the little patch of trees in the ditch and the park where there's some plants growing, and then all of the city in between. That's what creates our habitat islands. For different species, a road could even be something that makes an island, or something that wildlife can't cross, depending on how that animal moves. It's a little bug that can't fly, or if it's, you know, of course, we've all seen, unfortunately, all the roadkill. So these things that we might not see as boundaries and edges can pose a real problem for our wildlife. Anyways, back to every backyard, no matter how small, can become a part of the solution. So you don't have to have an acreage to be able to make a difference. Even if you've got a little, you know, postage stamp backyard, you can still make a big difference to wildlife. And so when we're talking about shelter, we're talking about cover, right? So animals need to hide from their predators, they need to hide from the elements, and they need space to have nests. Birds have nests, insects have nests, you know, little voles and moles, things like that. Shelter provides cover for all of those things. So when we're incorporating native plants into our landscape, shrubs, trees, flowers, and grasses, we are providing the shelter that wildlife needs. Food. This is where it gets really exciting for me. So I'm a big weirdo, and I'm obsessed again with, like Amy said in my intro, she wasn't joking, I'm obsessed with pollinators. And knowing that I'm providing food for them in my own backyard is just, it really makes me excited, and I really love it. So food is really important. Just because it's green, just because it's a plant, does not mean that it's food. For example, a host plant, let's go here first. 90%, oh my God, that is a huge number. 90% of our insects can only reproduce on plants in which they share an evolutionary history. So they have co-evolved for thousands of years with specific plants, and their bodies have changed and adapted with chemicals or even their mouth parts to be able to eat certain plants. So they don't have those plants, they're unable to make it to adulthood. And that specific plant that those insects have evolved with is called a host plant. Now there's host plants for a lot of different insects, but just two quick examples I'm going to give you are the monarch and the swallowtail. So monarch obviously is one of our flagship insects with host plants. You have to have milkweed. If you don't have milkweed, you don't have monarchs. That's it. You can't just magically create adult monarchs. You have to have food for the caterpillars to eat. And caterpillars can only eat milkweeds. There's different types of milkweeds that they can eat, but it has to be in the milkweed family. So if you don't have milkweeds in your yards, you are not producing monarchs. You're not being someone who provides a resource for a caterpillar to become an adult monarch. If you do have milkweed in your yard, you are doing that. You are the one who is helping create more monarchs for us and for their populations. So this is a giant swallowtail. Not just monarchs are not the only ones that have host plants. So this caterpillar is really funny. It's actually camouflaged to look like a bird poop, which I think is hilarious. It works great for the caterpillar, because who wants to eat bird poop, right? So they eat prickly ash shrubs. That's their host plant. But prickly ash shrubs are not the only plant they can eat. They can eat a few other types of plants, like they can eat citrus shrubs too. But for example, they can't eat bluegrass, Kentucky bluegrass. That's not food to them. That's might as well be plastic. And they grow up to be these beautiful, gigantic swallowtails. So host plants, if you like butterflies and you want butterflies in your yards, finding out what their host plants are is the perfect way to get those butterflies in your yard. So that's not all, right? We don't just have butterflies to worry about. When you are providing native plants in your yard, sorry, if I'm like super twitchy and moving around, it's because I'm used to like running around while I'm talking and waving my arms in the air. So this whole sitting at a computer and talking to you guys is making me fidgety. I'm used to moving around. So I apologize for that. Don't look at my camera, just look at the screen, and then you won't see me moving around. All right, so nectar and pollen. Nectar and pollen is super important for bees especially. It is important for hummingbirds and for butterflies and for other things like beetles, all pollinators. Pollen is what they eat, and nectar also. So when you're choosing your plants, and we'll get into a little bit more in depth later on how and why, which species you could choose, think about what kind of plants they are. So plants that have not been hybridized and are locally native tend to produce the most nectar and pollen. So for example, you don't get this fancy double petal, pest-proof plant that's been genetically altered by humans. That's hybridizing plants, humans coming in and purposely changing the genetics. And a plant that's locally native, we'll talk a little bit more in depth about what a native plant is, something that's native to a local area. They've co-evolved with our bees and butterflies and insects, so they provide what they need. And again, this is just an overview. I feel like I've said again like a million times. This is just an overview. We're going to get a little bit more in depth as we go. But when you put these plants in your yard and you're providing food for insects, you're not just benefiting the insects, you're benefiting the whole food web. And if anyone here has been following some of the newer tests and studies that have been coming out, they found out that it takes around 9,000 of these fat little caterpillars to feed one nest of chickadee babies. So if you have plants in your garden that are not getting chewed on and they don't have caterpillars crawling around on them, you don't have the food that these birds are looking for. So they have to fly further. They've got to be more likely to be injured by cats and cars and things as they're going further afield to find the insects for their babies. It's a lot of work. So if you are providing these insects, you are helping make fat chickadee babies and fat songbirds. All right. So food and shelter is something that we can really help and benefit our wildlife with just in our backyard, and the way we choose to do the things we can control, right? We can't control what's going on, far away in some rainforest right now, right? But we can control what's going in our backyards. That's our domain, and we can make that a productive domain. And why? Why do we need to even worry about this? Just gonna go through a little bit of backstory about why I hate lawns. Some of you who've listened to my talks before know that I cannot stand lawns. I think that the only purpose we should ever have a lawn for is to have a path to walk on. So looking at this depressing slide here. So residential lawns, think about like Kentucky bluegrass, you know, those cool seasons, non-native exotic grasses that we bring in because they grow thick and short and super green, right? Those grasses are not natives. They have not evolved for thousands of years to grow in our environment. So they require a lot of energy and input to survive and to make them look healthy. We found out that they require more irrigation than any of our other agricultural crops that we have in the United States, which a lot of our other crops are not native plants either, but lawns suck up so much water and pesticides. Apparently, homeowners love putting pesticides on their lawns. 80 million pounds of pesticides each year going on just residential lawns. That is a ton of inputs. All right, so we're wondering how much lawn is there, right? How is this such a big deal? Why is it a problem? Well, here's a 2005 study. A satellite study from NASA found that American residential lawns take up more than 31 million acres of land, of earth. And this is bigger than the whole state of Mississippi. If you put all that lawn together, it's going to be the size of Mississippi. That was in 2015. Guess what? It just got worse. The most recent estimate is that it's 40 million acres of lawn. Now we're bigger than the state of Illinois. And on this 40 million acres of lawn, guess what? We got to give them haircuts, right? Got to make them look good. Got to make them look uniform. So we're spending 800 million gallons of gas every single year to mow that stuff. So I refuse to mow the lawn at my house. Ask my husband. But he mows it. That's okay. I'm working on turning it all into flowers. So we don't have to have it all lawn, right? We can change the way things look. We can turn that sod grass that's practically a void, right? There's no food growing up. There's no insects in that lawn. Well, there is, but there's not a lot. There's not a lot of diversity. But I didn't put a slide in here for this, but I did want to mention that, you know, we're not producing a lot of insects for birds to eat or pollinators when we have lawns, but you know what we are producing is Japanese beetle grubs. Japanese beetle grubs love eating the cool season grass roots. So all of these huge, beautiful acreages that people have, just acres and acres of lawn grass, you can thank them for their big crops of Japanese beetle grubs that come and eat the rest of your plants. Okay, so sorry if this makes you feel sick, just look away. It's like flying. We know there's a problem and we're losing our pollinators, our populations are going down, songbird populations are going down. There's a lot of sad kind of negative stuff that's happening, but there is something that we can all do about it, and it's to lose the lawn. That's not the only thing we can do, but that's what I like to focus on. So, well, how do we do that? First of all, most people are raised, and I was, and I'm sure most every American is raised this way, that if you have a nice lawn, you are a good neighbor, right? So this is what your lawn is supposed to look like. This, I think, is in Florida, so it's got a different type of grass, but it's pretty much the color, right? It's uniform, there's not much growing in there, it's flat, it's I'll use Chad Gravy's term. He's our ranger here at Hitchcock. He says it's a drug-addicted carpet. And it's drug-addicted because it takes a ton of water and fertilizer and herbicide inputs to have a green carpet. That's literally what it is. It doesn't do a lot for us. So we've all been told that this is what we're supposed to have if we're a good neighbor, right? When your house looks nice, it'll sell for higher if you have a nice looking lawn. It doesn't have to be that way, right? But if you are not someone who thinks a lot about biodiversity and thinks about pollinators, you might see, well, Jenny. We're just about to talk about flowers. It's like you knew, right? So you might see someone who has a flower garden as weeds, right? And maybe you'll get the weed commissioner, call the weed commissioner, say, my neighbor has weeds, right? Well, there is a secret weapon, and it's a sign. So if you get a sign and put it in your yard that says what you are doing, you have a butterfly garden, a pollinator garden, whatever you want to call it. Signs are magic. Someone who knows nothing about butterflies and pollinators might see your lawn that has a lot of structure, has a lot of different plants growing in it as weeds. But if you have a sign that says what it is, all of a sudden they might not know anything about butterflies or bees, but they'll say, oh, it's a butterfly garden. Great, that's cool. So just in case you have some neighbors out there who might want to be difficult, I really have found that a sign makes a huge difference. So you don't have to necessarily go out and buy one of these fancy signs. You can make your own sign, but it makes a huge difference. I would really highly encourage anyone to put a sign out, especially if you're living in the city. And here I forgot to mention that this is some of the great biodiversity we have just in the realm of bees. This is the world's biggest bee. It's the Wallace's giant bee, and it's sitting on a quarter here. It's a mason bee. And then we have this little tiny guy right here. They say Perdita minima. They say they're so small that they can fly right through mosquito netting. So if we want to keep this diversity of wildlife and animals, we have to have a diversity in flowers and plants. So part of this is what can we do, right? We know there's a problem and we want to do something about it. So we could protect existing habitats, right? We can protect the stuff that we already have. But today is about enhancing and restoring lost habitat. So basically what your yard is lost habitat. It used to be something else. Maybe it's prairie, maybe it's woodland, maybe it's savanna, whatever. But then we built a city, we tore everything down to build our houses, and then we put a rug on top of it, which is our lawns. So we can restore that habitat. And reducing stressors like pesticides. I'm just gonna get into this very, very quickly towards the end. In any way that you can, please try to reduce your pesticides. They are not selective. They do not only kill mosquitoes or grubs or whatever, they kill all the insects. And spread the word. There's 38 people in this webinar. Maybe a few of you have a couple at home that are watching at the same time. That's not enough, right? We're not enough. We have to talk to our friends and neighbors and let them know about this too. We all have to try to spread the word. All right. Okay, so where do we start? This section is going to be about like literally starting your garden. How to prep the ground for seed or for plants, different places to get plants and seeds from, some different suggestions about flowers to choose, what you need to think about when you're first starting. Anyone can do this, right? You don't have to be a landscaper to do this. You can go outside, dig a hole in the ground, and put a native plant in. And that is good. That's starting the transformation of your yard. It's okay to start small. So let's get into this. So where do you put a pollinator garden? Wherever you can, right? So a lot of people get a little bit antsy about starting to convert their lawn over to gardens. So good places to start are places where your lawn won't grow. You have somewhere that's too shady or too wet or too sunny or too dry. Remember these cool season grasses that we use to make lawns? They're not native to our area, so they have not adapted to the conditions that we have. So sometimes it's really hard to get them to grow in a certain area. So if you have a spot like this that looks not very nice, start here. Or edges. That's always really pretty when people take something like this where it's just a solid mass of green grass and they take the edges out and they put flowers and shrubs and trees right along the edges. That's a good place to start. Or really whatever space you have. Not everybody has a backyard. If you've got somewhere where the sun reaches, make a potted pollinator garden. The only problem with these is you have to water them a lot because the little bit of soil in your pots can dry out pretty quickly. but you could still do it. Get some pots, get some dirt, stick some plants in there, and bees and butterflies will come and they'll make use of it. So you found a spot. Now what? Take a piece of paper and a pencil and start sketching out your plan. Or just go crazy like I did when I first started. I killed all the grass in my backyard and I threw a bunch of seeds out. I mean, it was an interesting experiment. It was very wild, but I loved it very much. And it has since changed numerous times. First of all, how much sun do you get? So grasses and flowers, just like different animals, just like humans, they need specific parameters to live in. Humans, you know, if it's too cold or too hot, we have a hard time. If we can't live in the middle of the ocean, right? We're not meant to live in the water. So plants are the same. Some of them need shade, some of them need sun. So how much sun are you getting in the spot you've chosen for your flowers? And then find out, again, is the soil wet or dry? Do you have a really dry spot where the sun bakes it all day? Do you have a really shady, wet spot that's always soggy? There are native plants for all of these different things. Think about Iowa, Nebraska. You know, there's different ecosystems. They all have different situations. Some of them have really dry hills. Some of them are real wet and shady. They all had native plants growing on them. There's no area where there wasn't a plant growing. So it's native plants for every type of situation you have. And how much space do you have? So there's some plants that grow really tall, like Maximilian sunflowers get up to be 7 or 8 feet. So if you have space for that, that's great. But if you don't have a lot of space, you probably don't want to choose that plant. Now getting into plant choices, again, I said this, different plants need certain amounts of sunlight and moisture and space. So for example, if you've got a sunny, dry spot and you've got enough space where you can have a tall plant there, a gray-headed coneflower would be a great choice for that. That's a native flower. That's this yellow one right here. They get a little bit on the tall side, about 4 foot tall, and they thrive in super hot, dry spots, right? Or if you've got a real shady spot and it's kind of soggy, right? The sun doesn't really ever hit it very much because it's on the side of your house that you don't get sun. Jack in the pulpit is a native shade tolerant plant. So again, there's plant species for every situation you might have. And pollinators love gray-headed coneflower and they love Jack in the pulpit. So if you're like, you know, I'm not someone who knows a ton about plants, because most of us don't spend all day, you know, learning about plants. If you find a seed catalog or you go to a native plant website, there is all kinds of information. You don't have to find out by yourself. You could just find out what plants you like and see where could you put them. For example, these bluebells are native plants and they grow in the shade. So sun exposure here we see is partial shade, and they like medium wet to medium soil. So they like a little bit wet, a little bit dry, but not super dry. They can't handle that. And it even tells you when did they bloom, right? How tall do they get? So you could find all this information. You don't have to know it all by yourself. And the internet is the most amazing tool ever. You can pretty much find any information you need. Like, I kind of like the idea of having a prairie larkspur in my yard. And I wonder, I don't know, do I have the space for it? Do I have the sun for it? So I'm like, how much sun does a prairie larkspur need? And the internet told me it could go pretty much anywhere except for deep shade, right? Full sun to partial shade. They're pretty adaptive. They can be in a lot of places. So there is a huge number of plant choices out there. In the beginning, it's basically what can you get your hands on that's actually native. That's kind of how I started. All right, site details. All right, so you found a spot where you want to plant your plants. You've got kind of some of the details. You've figured out how much sun hits it, how dry the soil is, how much space you really have. Now what do? You still got lawn there, right? Because my main point of what I like to stress is that we don't need to find new space for our gardens. We can just kill some of the grass off and make a new garden there. So you can't just take a bunch of seeds and throw them into the grass and think you're going to have a beautiful garden, because that grass has been hybridized and chosen specifically because it doesn't let other plants grow through it. It's, you know, we advertise it as it doesn't let weeds grow, right? So it's not going to let a lot of other stuff grow either, except for dandelions, because dandelions are amazing and like super tough. So there's 4 ways here we're going to talk about to kill sodgrass and to get rid of it, to get it out of the way. There's other ways as well, but this is just what we're going to talk about. And there's some pros and cons to them, and it really depends on what is important to you, right? If you don't like herbicides, you're trying to cut down on the chemicals you use, then you're probably not going to want to use herbicides. So there's some mechanical ways of doing it. How much time do you have, right? Do you want to do it right now, or are you going to do it in a couple months? How much prep time you have? So it all kind of makes a difference. So we're going to go through them very quickly just to give you an idea of some options. So the first one, dig it up, right? So literally you take a spade, and a flat edge spade or whatever kind of shovel you have, it doesn't matter, and you are digging up the grass. So you cut it, and there's, again, I'm not going to go into super in-depth on all of these, but if you go on YouTube, there's some really good videos say, how do you cut sod with a spade? And they'll show you exactly how to do it. It's hard work. I've done that on part of my yard, and it is hard work. You will be building muscles. But again, you don't use chemicals. It's quick, like depending on how fast you're working, you could start planting plants the same day. And it's best for relatively small sites because of its hard work. So you just basically cut down through the grass just beneath the short roots of that sod grass, because sod has pretty short roots and it sticks together. It's like pulling up a carpet. It's really weird. So that's one way. Another way is smothering. So with smothering, you're kind of, there's 2 different ways that you can use smothering. You can either use smothering with solarization, where you're kind of cooking the ground, which is fine. I mean, it's going to kill the grass, and it does kill, like if you have foxtail seeds and weed seeds, it's good for that. It takes usually like a black tarp or a clear plastic tarp, and you're using the sun like a solar oven. So that's solarizing. It takes a few weeks, especially if you do it in the summer. It's better because it works faster. Summer's hotter. But this one is specifically talking about smothering. So think like a lasagna. You can use whatever you have. Some people use black plastic, newspapers, cardboard, and mulch, right? You don't have to spend a lot of money on it. Just use whatever you have. Again, this doesn't take any chemicals because you're killing off the grass by smothering it, by keeping the sunlight away from it. It does take a while. So smothering, it does take a while. 4 to 6 weeks is what has been quoted to kill off that grass. But if you see this one here, someone's just used a tarp they had and they threw some bricks on the top. Again, you might have neighbors that are like, oh my gosh, what is happening? Why does this look so ghetto, right? A sign will make a huge difference, because you can't be standing out in front of your yard telling your neighbors, your nosy neighbors who are like, what are they doing? If you just make a little sign, say, hey, you know, butterfly garden in progress, or something like that. I'm surprised. It makes a huge difference. So this one right here is a tarp, and the one on the bottom, these people put this cardboard down and they're starting to cover it with some mulch. So they necessarily don't, depending on what your end goal is, you don't really need to use or to bring back the cardboard. You can cover it with cardboard and then cover it with mulch, and then plant your plants into that. So you dig up a hole right here, plant your plants into that if you like the mulch look. It smothers any grass, so it will smother brome grass as well. Nothing can survive under there if you leave it on long enough. Okay, or this one, tilling. Kind of like how people till their vegetable gardens. I do and I don't like tilling. It's very fast, but it brings up all the weed seeds. So it churns up the soil, and any seeds that are weed down there, they'll come up, and you'll have to fight weeds. You do have to fight weeds regardless, but this tends to be more weedy. Again, no chemicals, it's super fast. You'll have to find a tiller. Maybe you borrow one from a neighbor or you rent one. And it breaks up the soil structure. So if you learn about soil science, soil structure is part of like when the microorganisms and the earthworms, I forgot the word earthworm, while they're moving around and digging up down there, they help create a structure, and that helps with the helps water percolate down into the soil. So when you till, you're basically taking all that structure and grinding it up, and then it's all fluffed up, and then you have to smush it back down, and you're losing all those pores and those holes that are in the soil that helps with the percolation of water. So, I mean, you'll get it back after you plant your garden, but it just kind of messes things up for a little while. I'm not a huge fan of tilling, but it's an option. Okay, now chemical burn, that's where you get the herbicide from. So there are grass selective herbicides, or you can use something like glyphosate, which is Roundup, that will kill any plant. So you'll be killing any weeds or any plants that they're growing there that aren't grass. Again, you're using chemicals, and there's studies that are telling us that this is not good to use chemicals. So if you don't want to use chemicals, don't go down this path. There's other ways. Most likely you'll need more than one application. You mow down your grass, you spray it, then you wait a couple weeks, you see what's coming back, and then you spray it again. So it takes a little time, and you need to buy herbicide, and it's not very cheap. It's not going to break the bank, but it's definitely not the cheapest way to go about this. But you kill everything, right? And then you don't mess up with your soil structure, and you can just plant right into that dead grass. So there's all kinds of different ways to kill grass, but it has to be killed, I'm telling you. I tried planting native plants into lawn, and the lawn it stunts everything and it takes over. It's a pain in the butt. Okay, I think here, I feel like I am talking nonstop, so this seems like a good spot to maybe take a couple questions. I saw some come in that I didn't really respond to yet, so we're just gonna take a couple minutes.
Hey, Michelle.
Yes.
Dory had a question about the comment with regard to lawns, the amount of lawns. She was wondering if that statistic that you quoted, is that in the United States and not Europe?
Yes, that's just the United States.
Okay. And then Cindy asked a question about if you can plant a pollinator garden in the shade, and if so, will it attract bees and butterflies? And you did address that a little bit.
You can. There are tons of shade tolerant natives. Butterflies go in the shade just like they do in the sun. If you've got shade, you can have a butterfly garden, definitely. You just have to, I would Google or whatever, shade tolerant natives, and there's plenty of flowers that bloom in the shade.
And then she's also wondering, do you need to do anything special to that soil after you remove the grass or kill it?
So it depends on what you're doing. And after our questions, I'm going to go into whether or not you're choosing to plant seed or plugs. And it depends on how you like to garden. I actually don't really know a lot about gardening, which is weird because I have a pollinator garden. But everything I've done, I've just kind of done with the soil I have in compost that I make at home. But there's all kinds of things that you could do. You could take a soil sample and send it in to your extension office. They test it for you and tell you, like, is it really acidic? Is it really basic? Do you need to put maybe some compost in there? Is it really clayey, so it doesn't have very good water retention? Is it really sandy? A lot of that stuff can affect what plants you grow, but natives, I mean, they're not perfect. They will die, but they are so resilient because they evolved to live here. They evolved to deal with our tough hot summers, freezing winters. So I would not say you have to add the special soil, but you can if you know how to do it, if you want to. Long story short, you don't have to.
Another question came in, Michelle. Sue is asking, is it possible to smother brome?
Yes. Yep. You make sure you mow it down before you, because brome gets pretty tall. So I would mow it very short and then go with the smothering process, and it'll kill it.
All right. And one more thing here. Dory mentioned mycelium. Do you want to talk about what that is?
No, because I am not an expert on mycelium, but I do know that people purposely buy it and add it to the soil because it is part of food web and it helps to keep your plants healthy. And I just don't know a lot about mycelium, so I don't want to talk about it to let you guys know how little I know about it. But if you, Dory, if you know a lot about mycelium, or someone else, one of our 39 participants, know good things about mycelium, put them in the chat box. I mean, I'd be happy if we all shared our knowledge. The smothering killed beneficial soil bacteria. If you solarize, so if you use the plastic to technically cook the soil underneath, it can kill some of the bacteria that's on the top layer of the soil, but the stuff that's beneath it should be fine. You're not irradiating it, it just gets pretty hot. Okay, so should we keep going? Anybody have last minute questions? We're gonna have a question session at the end too, so. Okay, I'm gonna keep going then. And I just wanna remind you guys that this is a beginner's presentation for starting, right? So if we don't get into anything super in depth that you wanted to know about, I apologize. Feel free to put it in the chat box, but my main point for doing this presentation is to let you know that you do not have to be a fancy gardener. You don't have to know anything about plants and gardens to do this. You don't have to be a landscaper. Anyone can do it. So I just wanted to make it as simple and easy to understand as possible. I know there's many rabbit holes we can go down, so I'm just gonna keep going as we are. So planting, you've got your grass killed off, okay? You're ready to go. Now thinking about plants, I've said over and over so far, natives, natives, natives. Now, what is a native plant, right? So native plants, think about before the Euro-Americans came to North America. These are the plants that have been growing here and evolving here with all of the other insects and birds and wildlife and bacteria and viruses and fungi. They've been co-evolving with everyone. So these are the guys who've been around. They're not someone from Asia or from Europe, right? That are native. So a plant that's native to Europe is not native to North America. It's great for Europe and for European insects, but it's not good for North American insects. Native plants tend to need less babying. They have evolved to be in our climate, so they're usually drought tolerant if they're plants that like the sun. They can cope with the diseases that we have around here if they're native diseases. They have that coevolution with insects, so a lot of insects actually have specific plants that they like to be on. I have a stat here somewhere. Oh, 1/3 of our native bee species will only collect pollen from specific native plants. So they have specialized on our native plants. They've evolved so closely with them that they need them. So there's things called cultivars or nativars. You might see nativars in the big box garden centers. Those are, they tend to be, so they're like, Amy, give me an example of one of your echinacea plants that is a cultivar. It's like an orange purple coneflower that has been, so purple coneflower is a native plant, right? But someone in the nursery came around and said, hey, let's make this fancier, right? Let's change the genetics. Let's hybridize it with something that makes it orange. There are some studies that say that our local native bees and butterflies don't get as much out of them, but the jury's still out on that. We don't know enough yet to know if they really provide less pollen and nectar, but what we do know is that they don't have any diversity in them. So they're all made to be the same, so that when you buy them from the store, every year they make seed, and that same seed makes the same orange coneflower. And genetic diversity is super important for a healthy ecosystem. So we like to stick to local ecotypes that are not cultivars. And quickly, again, we don't want to go down any of the rabbit holes because there's just too much stuff we could talk about. A local ecotype is a native plant that has evolved in a local area. Think about the Loess Hills, right? The Loess Hills in in Iowa, and we have a little bit of the Loess Hills over in Nebraska, but there are plants that have genetics that for like a blue stem. A local ecotype blue stem has evolved and adapted to live in the Loess Hills, and the genetics suit it to that area. So you could even get as specific as you want and have a local ecotype plant. Some of these things are a little harder to find. On those documents that I sent you are all kinds of links to find native plants and seeds. So if you're like, I don't know where to find native plants and seeds, because they're hard to find in our big box stores like Menards or whatever, they don't carry a lot of natives, or they have the native cultivars. So there's other places to find them. Okay, so native plants, as far as we know with all the studies we've done, they are the best plants for our pollinators and to support our food web. So if you can, always choose native plants. And it's okay if you have other non-native plants in your garden. You don't need to go around and kill all of that stuff unless it's an invasive one. But when you're adding plants to your garden, please choose native first if you can. All right, let's keep moving. Blooming through the season. So talking about pollinators and birds too, they're not just around in the summer when everything's hunky-dory and nice and beautiful, right? They're around in the early parts of spring, and they need to have food. They're around in the hot summer, they have to have food, and they're around in late fall, and they have to have food, especially our migrating monarchs. So if you have the opportunity to choose different species of plants, now we're talking about nectar and pollen, so we're talking about flowers, that bloom all through the season, then you'll be providing food and resources to our pollinators all year long, except for winter, of course. And there's many different places to look to find out when something blooms. Again, when I showed you guys the bluebells, and it was from one of those native seed websites, it said when it bloomed, how tall it got. That's where you can find it. There's some of the books and resources that I've shared with you will tell you when things bloom. So there's all kinds of ways you can find out when they bloom. But just a quick example, if you want something that blooms early in spring, April, this is in my backyard. These are violets. Our violets that people hate to have in their lawn and they kill them off because they think they're weeds are not weeds. They're native plants, and they provide pollen and nectar early for our bumblebee queens and for some of the early butterflies that come out. In June here, we have spiderwort. So that's in the middle of the summer. And late summer, August, we have bee balm here, or wild bergamot. And late in October and even into November, if we have a long season, goldenrod is a huge provider of pollen and nectar, especially for our migrating monarchs and for the bumblebees that are getting ready to hibernate. So if you can, the more species you have, and having species that bloom all year is really important. Okay, so I'm not going to get a ton into where and how to plant, just that you need to do maintenance. One of the things I will say is that when you are planting your plants, if you use plugs, especially, and we'll talk about plugs in a little bit, try to plant them in mass or masses, which is basically when you have 4 or 5 of the same types of plants in a blob, right? You make them in an area next to each other. We found out that it looks really pretty. People like the way it looks aesthetically. And our pollinators, they tend to like to go to the same type of flower over and over. Oh gosh. Okay, I'm talking too fast, which is something I do. So thank you for telling me I was talking too fast. I'll try to slow down a little bit. I just didn't want to bore anyone. But I'll try to slow down. Thank you. Let's see. So planting. Now it's time for planting. Do not fertilize. You do not need to fertilize native plants. Again, they have evolved to live here. They do not need fertilizer. If you fertilize, you're basically just going to feed the weeds. And there's going to be weeds. All new gardens will have weeds. So let's talk about seeds first. They give you more bang for your buck because they're cheaper to buy and you get more of them. They do take longer to establish, and we'll talk about that in a second because you don't have the mature plant right there, right? And native seeds are dormant when you first get them, and they have a dormancy so they don't accidentally sprout at the wrong time of the year and die, right? So you don't want to sprout in the middle of October and then not have enough root mass underground to survive the winter. So sometimes if you are germinating your own seeds inside, like I do, I germinate seeds over the winter because I go crazy if I don't have plants to play with. So there's different ways, and we're not going to get into seed germination. Again, there's too many things we could talk about, but please note that if you do have native seeds and you're trying to start them, do a little research because a lot of times they need something special to break their dormancy. All right, long-term investment. If you're doing a large area, seeds are a really good thing to do. Again, it's going to be cheaper and you can cover more ground. But something important to know about native plants is that they put most of their growth into their roots the first year. Even with plugs, they'll do most, because those are usually younger plants, they put like almost all of their energy into the root mass. 2/3 of their biomass is in their roots. Because if you have a lot of energy in your roots, when fire comes by or a drought comes by or you get frost killed, you still have a lot of energy in your root system to come and sprout again. So the first year we say they sleep. The majority of the energy goes into roots. So for the maintenance, you seeded maybe in the winter or you seeded in the spring and they're finally starting to germinate. What you need to do is make sure you mow because you're going to have weed pressure. You're always going to have weed pressure with these big seedings. And it feels wrong, right? You're like, I just planted these flowers and grasses. Why would I want to mow them off? What you're doing is you're mowing to kill the weeds. So you're mowing the weeds before they start to seed out, and you're mowing them high because you stop the seeds from setting from the weeds and you let more sunlight get down to the ground so more of the native seeds can germinate and the native seedlings can get enough sun. So that's the first year. It's not going to look, if you're lucky, it'll look pretty, right? Or if you know what you're looking at, it'll be beautiful. But usually they don't look that exciting the first year because they're not flowering yet. Year 2, you get some of our quicker germinating plants to flower, right? Right here, all this yellow is black-eyed Susan. But you do see a lot of weeds, right? Especially in these bigger areas because there's usually a weed bed. After you've killed the grass, there's usually a weed still down there. So again, you need to mow. And we usually mow in the middle of the summer, maybe in August, right when the weeds are getting about 6 to 12 inches tall. We call that boot high. If you have a tractor mower, it's easier to get 6 to 12 inches off the ground. If you have a smaller mower, it's harder to do that, but it's still okay. Again, most of the energy for your natives are in the roots. So it's not the end of the world if you cut their flower heads off. What you're doing is you're clearing out the weeds so that they don't set seed and you can get sun to the natives. So that's creeping. I don't know, we call that creep. In year 3, So year 3, they leap. Most of the flowers you have will be blooming. Most of the weed pressure, if you've done a good job maintaining them throughout the year, the couple years, most of the weed pressure will have gone by now because the natives will move in, they fill in all the gaps, and they don't leave a lot of room for weeds. So you'll be seeing a nice, beautiful, large area of blooming plants, and a lot of our native seeds actually will not germinate the first few years. So you may even be seeing new species germinating later on that you didn't see before. So it's always kind of a fun adventure when you're doing these big seedings. Sorry, I hope nobody's getting sick from the motion sickness. Okay, so that's if we're doing seeding. Now, with seeding, you can get a higher diversity mix, right? You can get 30 to 100 different species, and we know that more diversity is a healthier, stronger, more resilient ecosystem. So there are different things out there that you can find and use for free. So the Tall Grass Prairie has a seed calculator where they give you suggestions. You say what your soil is, how you're going to seed, when you're going to seed, what county are you in, and they have all kinds of different things that run in the background to tell you what species, what native species will be good, what choices they are. So if you want some suggestions on what species to choose from, you can go use this calculator, and there's other calculators as well. Also, the US in Iowa and Nebraska, the NRCS, so the Natural Resource Conservation Service, has people in their USDA offices that will help you choose what seeds to use. And you can just go online and find out who your providers are based on your county. So seeds takes a longer time, but you get more bang for your buck. If you use plugs, they are more expensive because they have to be grown in a nursery before you buy them, and that takes time and effort. But basically, you've got plants blooming right away. And it's kind of a build your own adventure because you can control where they go. With seeds, you're mixing them up all together and you're scattering them. So where the seeds land is random, and usually they germinate if they're in a good spot. So you might not have all of your seeds germinate. But if you use plugs, you can choose exactly where they go. Like when I suggested you plant your species all together in a mass, if you have plugs, you can do that. If you have seeds, you can't really unless you have all your seed species separated. So that's pretty fun. It's more expensive, again, like I said, and it's usually better for smaller areas because you have to plant them by hand. Weeding. Even if you don't do seeding, you're still gonna have to control weeds. Every single garden you do, anytime you disturb the soil, anytime you move plants around, those weeds are gonna come up, and you need to control them because they will compete with your native plants. Okay, and here's a suggestion for your new prairie garden or your native garden. If you, again, we're talking about neighbors, like we want to be good neighbors, and this idea of having pollinator gardens and having wildlife and habitat in the city is still weirdly a new idea. So a lot of people don't like it. So a good way to make your wild habitat garden look a little bit more controlled is to mow the edges. So it just gives people, it's a psychological thing, just like the signs, gives people an idea like, oh, this is a garden, not a weed patch. And again, if you do use plugs, you can make your wildlife garden look as landscaped as you want. It does not have to look like a prairie or like a jungle for it to be useful and very helpful for our pollinators. You can make it as structured and clean looking as you want, as long as you're using native plants that produce pollen and nectar and have leaves that caterpillars can eat, you're still making a huge difference. So it's really however you want your garden to look. What do you like? That's how you should be doing it. Okay, and watering. So we talked about how much water we use on our exotic drug-dependent rugs, right, our lawn. you really only need to water your native plant gardens when you first start them, right? When they're babies and when they're young. Once they're mature plants, you don't need to water them unless we're going through some major drought and you just don't want to lose them. If you overwater them, native plants, they're so adapted to being able to handle droughts that they might get much taller than you expected them to. So only water them when they're young. All right, now I said all these ways of how we start it, but where the heck do we get this stuff, right? So if you go to, again, a big box nursery or garden center, most of the time what you find there, and I actually called and talked to some of these places when I was making this list, asking them if they actually had native plants. Mostly what they have is exotic non-native plants, annuals from Europe, from Japan, and then these pest-proof varieties. So they've been hybridized so that insects can't eat them, or they are not from around this area, so they have different chemical compositions that our insects have not evolved to eat. Or again, there are these cultivars that have had selective breeding. So again, we don't have that genetic diversity. And we know that diversity is it. Diversity is what makes our ecosystem strong and healthy. So it can be hard to find these native plants that I keep touting and saying how great they are. So that's why I put together your long list of Iowa, Nebraska places, people, businesses, organizations that can provide you seed, can provide plugs. I don't have preferences, and I'm not going to say one is better than the other. You just have to call around, maybe do it based on what species they have available for you, what you're looking for. And then what I do is, so I don't have a very big garden, but I do have a lot of plants growing there, and I share them with my friends. And a lot of my friends' butterfly and bee gardens have started with the extra plants from my yard. So if you have more aggressive species like wild bergamot grows pretty quickly and goldenrod can try to take over a garden, share them with your friends. It's hard to find native plants, so we should share what we've got. See, and the further resources, I tried to trim that down, but I got so excited when I was putting it together. There's just a bunch of rabbit holes for you guys to go down, and good places to start your research if you want to dig deeper. So that is a quick and dirty, dirty, because we're going to be getting dirt under our fingernails, way to start your garden. But that's not everything. So we know that pollinators are not just around during the nice part of the seasons, right? They have to survive the winter. Not everybody's like a monarch that can just fly to Mexico. Not that that's easy. I'm not saying it's easy. Of course, it's awfully difficult. But they stick around and they have to overwinter. Some of them overwinter as eggs, some overwinter as pupa, but some overwinter as adults, and they need a safe place to go or else they will freeze to death and die or dry out. So stems. Stems are really important. And again, we have been kind of brainwashed to think that any dead plant material is bad. It's dirty, it's gross. You have a messy yard, right? We want these clean carpets that have nothing on them. But stems are so important, especially for bees, and not just bees, but other insects as well. But let's talk about bees right now. So this first picture that's behind the leave 15 inches of stem for your bee nurseries. This, I'm going to zoom in real quick. This is a picture of some leftover plants in my garden. I think they're wild bergamot. You can see that they're hollow, right? And so when they died, or this spring after they were dead, I was cleaning up my yard a little bit. I was cutting down some of the really tall stuff, but I left about 15 inches of the stem so that the bees this year can have their babies in there. So you see this picture right here shows you how bees make these really cool little chambers inside these hollow stems. So this right here is bee bread. It's basically pollen and nectar all put together and made into bread well, not made into a bread, but we call it bread. And they'll lay an egg on there, and the little baby larva bee will eat the bee bread, and then it'll be a pupa. And when it's all full grown, they'll come out, which is really amazing. And someday I hope I get to see that in real life. So I've done this right now, and as these wild bergamot grow back this year, the new lush green plants will hide the dead stems. So if you don't like the way it looks, you can know that it's not going to be like that forever. They'll eventually be hidden. And this year's bees will use them for their nurseries so that the bees can overwinter next year and come out in the spring. So that's one way you can help your pollinators survive the winter. Brush piles. Again, you don't have to have a super clean yard. Don't clean your yard, clean your house, right? So if you have a spot where you can leave a brush pile, please do. It's super important. Right here we have a bumblebee queen, and these ladies have to overwinter, and they look for a place like a brush pile, a pile of leaves, something that they can burrow into and sleep through the winter. So if you're constantly sending these out to yard waste and sending them out to the city, you're not going to have anywhere for them to be able to go and to be able to stay over the winter. So brush piles are really important for our pollinators. Okay, bare ground. Now this is something that a lot of people have problem with, and I get it. We've all been told it looks ugly, it's bare, you need to cover it, your grass is dead, you're a bad person, right? I'm sure we've all heard it in some way. But it's so important, way more important than I ever thought. So 60% of our native bees, and again, we're just talking about bees, there's tons of other pollinators, 60% of them are burrowers. That's a hard word to say. They burrow underground and make these chambers where they lay their eggs. It's pretty cool. But they can't do it if there's not bare ground. Even 1 inch of mulch can cover the soil enough that they can't get through it because they're just these little tiny bees. They can't move mulch. So if you're willing to, leave bare ground. It's really important for them. And if anybody asks you, to say that's where my bees are burrowing. And some of the early bees that you're seeing this spring are burrowing bees. They've come out from underground. And again, if you can leave seed heads, leave them. There's no rule saying you have to cut them off all the time, because insects and birds throughout the winter, they need those seeds and they eat them. They're super nutritious. So anytime you can have a little bit messier yard, please do. It's for our bees and butterflies. And that helps our insects to survive. And if our insects survive, there's plenty of food for our birds. All right, now we're gonna get to something a little bit bummer. Pesticides. Again, I said I was just gonna touch this very quickly. Just think before you use chemicals. Just take a moment and think about it. I know my family personally has, and friends have, used mosquito sprays for their yards, which doesn't make any sense to me because your yard is not in a bubble, right? Any other insects can move back in, the pesticides can move out of your yard, and it doesn't just kill mosquitoes, it kills any insect. And things like poisoning, for if you have a rat problem or you don't want mice around your house, please think, because they don't die immediately. They'll have the poison in their body and they'll get sick, and things like owls and foxes will come and they'll eat those poisoned mice and rats, and then they will die from poisoning. If you want to learn a little bit more about that, there's 2 links here, Xerces Society or xerces.org/pesticides and ourwater.ourworld.org are some really good sources to learn a little bit more about insecticides and pesticides. So please just think, take a moment. Okay, now you have some homework. Great. I know I went through this very quickly. There's tons more stuff to learn, all kinds of experiments that you guys can be doing in your yards, but this is a little bit of some starters if you want. These are some of the books that I have read recently that I thought were really good. Butterfly Gardening with Native Plants, and these are written down in the documents that we sent you, so if you don't If I go them quickly and you don't get their names written down, that's fine. Take a picture, but they're in the document. If you're super big on butterflies, you're, oh, I want butterfly host plants, right? I want to produce the caterpillars that make these amazing butterflies. This is a very good book. It lists all the different host plants and tells you where those plants need to be in the yard, and it's a really good book. This bee book by Heather Holm is also really good. It does the same thing for bees. It tells you what plants will attract which kinds of bees, and if those plants are native and where those plants should be planted. It also has a really cool identification for bees. So you could be like, hey, see that bee over there? That's an aphis doodly hoppin' majigger bee, right? Pretty cool. That lives and nests in a hollow stem. And you're gonna look really cool. Or like a big bee nerd, but that's okay. Both of those things are good. And then Bringing Nature Home is a very good foundational book on why we need to have habitat everywhere, not just in the quote unquote wild. Can you see my quote fingers? But in our cities and in our homes and backyards as well. It's a really good book. It helps me to really bridge the gap between how important plants and insects are to each other. And then here's a new garden ethic by one of our local, Benjamin Vokes. He's in Lincoln. And he is someone who helps people to turn their yards into native landscapes. So he is a landscaper that uses natives. So there are landscapers out there who will do that for you. You can do it yourself as well. So just a few books. That'll be a fun place to start for you. Again, there's all of those links on the documents I sent you and the internet. The internet is full of information. Anytime you have like, what's a good native plant for a moist spot in my backyard that's always shady, right? You can find that on the internet. But be careful, because you can go down many rabbit holes and you won't know how good you are at making your pollinator garden until you try. These are my dogs. I had to find a place to put them in my talk. So this is it. All right, that's the end of my talk. We're going to have some time for questions and answers. Thank you all for bearing with me, and thank you for the person who told me to slow down. I know I talk fast, and it helps to have a reminder.
All righty, Michelle. We have a few questions here. Yvonne wants to know, what are some of the native plants that bees need?
A lot. there's a huge list of answers for that, but that butterfly book, I'll go back to that butterfly book. This butterfly book has a list of plants that are actually good for butterflies, but they're good for bees. What's good for butterflies are good for bees as well. And it kind of ranks them. It has a 1 through 10 ranking based on how much nectar and pollen they provide. And I can't remember, I know 2 of the highest ones were milkweed and wild bergamot. They provide a lot of nectar and a lot of pollen for bees and butterflies. So any native plants you can get your hands on will be beneficial, but there are some out there who rank higher in productivity, right? They make a lot of nectar or they're really healthy. Another one is, maybe this will surprise some people, but our native thistles, tall thistle, pasture thistle, they're not invasive like the Canada thistle. That's not a native thistle. And they produce tons of pollen and nectar. And once they make their seeds, I'll tell you what, you have to fight with the birds to collect any of the seeds, because the seeds are super high in protein. The birds go crazy over them. So I don't know, not a super great answer, but I tried.
Hey, Michelle, Mark wants to know, can you use both seeds and plugs?
Absolutely. Yep. Get crazy. Do it up. There's no reason why you can't use both. Whatever you can get your hands on.
Michelle, I have a question. You had mentioned the importance of insects, and I'm wondering, how does a person go about changing people's minds about insects?
So that's a good question. If I had a really good answer, I think I would probably be doing that all the time. Doing something like this, having a beautiful garden full of flowers, full of butterflies, full of bees, you have the insects there. And if you can, depends on if you like that person, whether or not you want to invite them over to your home. If you do like them, you can show them how amazing they are and talk about why they're so important. And you'll be learning those things as you see the insects and watch what they do in your yard. It's hard for people who are afraid of bugs because they've been taught all their life that bugs are scary and gross. So that's kind of like something they have to relearn or unlearn. Just being exposed, I think, is the best way that I could really say. Going on a hike and seeing bugs, picking them up carefully and watching them and looking at them, or holding them yourself and gently showing someone. Don't throw a bug at someone. Don't ever use bugs as like a punishment, like, oh, gross, I'm going to throw this bug at you. That's a really hard question to answer. I wish I knew. If you've got a good suggestion, put it in the chat so that we can all see.
Michelle, I'm also wondering if you have some good advice regarding homeowners associations and some of those rules regarding height of lawns or the type of plants that are planted in yards.
Right. So again, things like a homeowners association and the weed commissioner and different cities have different rules and regulation for what a weed is and what designates a weed. I know that Council Bluffs has, if it's a purpose, and I'm not quite sure, but for Omaha, you'll have to look it up. If it's a purposely planted plant, then it's not a weed, regardless of how tall it gets. So if you know that you have native plants in your yard, they're purposely planted, and if someone calls you into the weed commissioner, which hopefully they wouldn't, and signs and talking to your neighbors about what you're doing is a good way to avoid that. But if they do, if you do have to go down that route, knowing what your plants are is important. Knowing that, you know, this is a goldenrod plant and it provides nectar for our migrating monarchs. You know, it's purposely planted because goldenrods get pretty tall and people might see that as a weed. If you keep your garden looking a little bit cleaned up, like again, mowing the edges, cutting back the really tall plants or putting tall plants in areas where they actually fit. But try not to let your garden flop over onto a sidewalk, things like that. Keeping them looking kind of clean and landscaped is a good way to prevent problems like that. Homeowners associations, if you talk to whoever is in charge there and tell them what you're planning on doing, communication is really important and helpful. Let's see, I think I had a note about that. Again, the signs are really important. Do your research so you know what you have in your garden and keeping it looking nice. All of those things prevent your yard from looking like weeds.
So you mentioned the signs, Michelle, and you showed a photo of some of those signs. Where can people find those?
So on the document that we shared out with you is a listing of different places to find the signs. Or you can Google, or whatever your preferred search engine is, pollinator signs. So for example, the Xerxes Society sells them. A lot of our natural organizations sell them. Tallgrass Prairie Center sells them, or you can make your own. And I have seen them in random stores as well. You can find a lot of signs.
Michelle, we have a question. When you kill the grass first with a chemical, do you need to remove all the dead matter before planting or seeding?
So it depends. So I think, Amy, I think you said before planting seed. So yes, seeds, if you just plop them out there in some thick, dense duff, which is like leftover dead vegetation, it's hard for them to reach the soil and they need to touch the soil to be able to germinate. So there's some things you can do. You can, depending on where you are and what you're allowed to do, you can mow really low, so mow off the grass, or you can burn the grass so that all of that dead stuff is gone and it's just bare soil. You can scruff it up with like a leaf rake or a grass rake. There's something you can rent. I forget what it's called, but it's like a garden roller. It's just big wheelbarrow that's really heavy that you can put the seed down, and then you literally roll over the top of it to smush it down into the grass or down into the soil. Or you can do the nerdy thing that I like to do. That's called the prairie dance, where you put your seed down and then you just stomp around on the seed and the soil and the grass, the dead grass, and you just stomp it into the ground. So yeah, you do want your seed to touch the soil.
Katie's asking, are there any pollinator native plants that would do well in container or balcony gardens?
Right. So balcony gardens are a great thing to have. I mentioned them before, and I did mention that you do need to make sure you keep an eye on the water, because they can dry out really fast with those containers and how much sun you're getting. It would be a good idea to put a little layer of mulch or shredded leaves on top of that soil so that it's not directly hitting by the sun. But as in what species would be good for container gardens, most of our native plants have pretty long roots, long root systems, and they can handle being in containers. It really depends how tall they get, and do you want a really tall plant? Do you have a big enough pot for that? Some good starters that I would suggest would be something like a coneflower, or black-eyed Susans are really adaptable and they don't get very tall. Wild bergamot, I always say wild bergamot is a great plant. Hoary vervain, you could pretty much put any flower in there. And if you have a big enough pot, you could put a shrub in there too, native shrubs. So I don't know, it's not a very good answer, but whatever you can get your hands on. If you got a big enough pot, you can put a lot of stuff in there. It really depends on how much sun they can get. Like if they start to shade each other out, you really want them to get enough sun.
All right, Michelle has or Dory is asking here if it's better to plant seeds in the fall.
Yes. So when I was talking about seeds, as in they might be dormant, they usually have really hard seed coats. And if you plant them in the fall, they'll go through the winter being exposed to the freezing and thawing of the winter. And that does tend to crack a seed coat. And then they're able to germinate, because chemicals in the seed will basically tell itself that it has gone through a winter, so that when they feel the warmth of the sun and they get a lot of moisture, they'll know that they're free and clear into spring. I know that's kind of anthropomorphizing seeds, but they do it all chemically. So you don't have to wait till fall, but if you can, you'll probably have more germinate the first year. You don't have to, but it's better.
Alrighty, I see a lot of comments coming in regarding the handouts that Michelle has been referring to. And if you joined us a little bit late, in the beginning I had mentioned that I had sent those out via an email earlier today. If you were not originally registered for the program, you probably didn't receive those. If you didn't receive them and you're interested in them, would you send me an email at environmentaleducation at pottcounty-iowa.gov, and I'll type that again in the chat box here, and I will be sure to get those sent out to you.
And this is being recorded. This is our first time recording it, so hopefully it worked. And if it does work, then we will share it on our social media. And I'm typing that in there to our email. It's very long, so copy paste it.
Before the program started too, I mentioned another online program that we have coming up on April 28th. It's a Tuesday evening at 6 o'clock. We will be offering the film documentary Green Fire, which is about the legendary conservationist Aldo Leopold. And that film will be followed with a discussion with a local Aldo Leopold scholar, Ron Caesar. So if you are interested in that and want more information about that, you can find that on the Pottawattamie Conservation website as well. The program tonight was originally supposed to be an in-person event, and we do have some free starter native plants available, and starting Monday we are going to have those available here at Hitchcock Nature Center Lodge. They will be on the west side of the building, the lower level. So come help yourself, take 2 or 3. It's just on the honor system, and you will need to bring maybe a small box or a bag to take those home in.
Right. Thank you for reminding me of those plants. So those are some of the plants that I germinated from seed over the winter. I collected those. They're all native to Council Bluffs, Southwest Iowa area. They'll be fine in Omaha too. So they're all natives. They're wild collected. They are blue pitcher sage and hoary vervain. It's hoary as in like fuzzy, like frosty, like hoarfrost. And we do have some milkweed as well. They're very young still because they've just been growing since this winter. They have not been hardened off, which is a term we use for being able to survive the cold and the sun outside because they've been growing inside. I have an office that is completely taken over by plants. So what you want to do when you bring them home is make sure that you don't leave them outside if it's going to be lower than 40 degrees. And you can Google hardening off seedlings and you can get some more information, but basically you just put them outside every day for a couple hours, then bring them back inside, put them out, bring them back so they can slowly adapt to crazy, scary temperatures that they're not used to because they're just little baby plants. And you can do your Google search or on hoary vervain and blue pitcher sage and find out where they need to go, if they can handle being in certain parts, how much sun they need, how much water they need. Get used to doing that because you're going to learn a lot about plants if you start getting into this native gardening. I know I have.
So someone's asking about what time those plants will be available on Monday, and they'll be available around 8 o'clock.
Right.
The information or the directions on where you can find those here at the Hitchcock Nature Center Lodge is in the email with the handouts that Michelle is referring to. Anybody has any more questions?
So again, make sure you tell your friends, whether or not they want to hear it, about how fun it is to have a butterfly garden. Tell your neighbors, your coworkers, because you can make a difference. It is up to us to be able to turn our cities back into a place where our wildlife can be because we need them. It's really important. And just because you're living in the city doesn't mean you can't have habitat in your backyard. Thank you all. Again, if you have any questions or you didn't get those handouts, email us at our email, which I will put in here one more time. And we are going to sign out. Again, thank you very much for coming. This was a lot of fun. It was our first time doing this. And it was a little bit odd for me to be talking to a computer, but it's good to see you guys chatting because then I know there's real people out there.
All right, thanks everyone. Have a good evening.
All right, have a great night. I hope everybody can find some fun spring weather trouble to get into.